Some engines don't die. They wait for someone stubborn enough to believe in them. Rain hammered against the neon windows of Rosie's diner just after midnight, turning the empty highway outside into a river of blurred headlights and silver reflections. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee and frying bacon lingered in the air long after the dinner crowd had gone home. Naomi Brooks wiped down the counter with tired hands, her red uniform stained faintly with grease that no amount of soap ever seemed to remove. Most people in Ashbury thought she worked too hard for tips that barely covered rent, but none of them knew where she disappeared every night after closing. The old garage behind the diner glowed faintly beneath a flickering yellow bulb, hidden from the road by rusted fencing and stacks of broken tires. That was where the real work began. The bell above the diner door jingled sharply as a black Rolls-Royce pulled into the parking lot. Naomi glanced up. Every conversation in the room stopped. Victor Langford stepped out beneath a massive black umbrella, his polished shoes splashing through puddles as if the storm itself moved out of his way. Everyone in America knew his face. Billionaire investor. Founder of Langford Motors. The man who once turned a failing electric car company into a multi-billion-dollar empire. He entered the diner without looking at anyone, removing his leather gloves slowly while rainwater dripped from the edges of his coat. "Coffee," he said calmly, sliding into a booth by the window. Naomi nodded once and poured it fresh. Victor glanced toward the back lot while stirring cream into his cup. Under the weak garage light sat a faded 1967 Mustang fastback covered in dust, primer spots, and years of neglect. Its hood was open. Tools lay scattered around it like surgical instruments abandoned mid-operation. The car looked more ghost than machine. Victor smirked faintly. "That car is dead," he said. A few customers laughed under their breath. Naomi didn't. She carried his coffee over carefully, setting the mug down without spilling a drop. "Maybe," she replied softly. Victor looked up, mildly amused now. "Maybe." Naomi folded the rag in her hands. Not everything dead stays buried. The diner fell strangely quiet after that. Even the rain seemed softer somehow. Victor studied her for a moment longer than necessary. She couldn't have been older than 24. Dark curls tied back beneath a faded bandana. Exhaustion in her eyes, but something else too. Defiance. The kind that didn't disappear just because life got hard. He glanced back toward the Mustang. "That heap out there?" he asked. "It'll never run again." Naomi looked through the rain-streaked window toward the car. Her father's car. The last thing he touched before he died 15 years earlier. Most people saw rust. She saw fingerprints. Memories. Promises. "Guess we'll find out," she said quietly. Victor let out a low chuckle and reached for his wallet. "Hope," he muttered, standing slowly, "can get expensive." Naomi watched him place a $100 bill on the table untouched beside the coffee. Outside, thunder rolled across the city skyline while Victor's driver opened the Rolls-Royce door. But before stepping into the car, Victor glanced one last time toward the glowing garage behind the diner. Naomi was already outside now, sleeves rolled up despite the cold, wiping rainwater from the Mustang's cracked windshield with extraordinary care, like someone touching an old scar they never truly stopped carrying. Then deep in the darkness of the garage, the dead engine coughed once. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the rain had faded into a cold mist that wrapped around the diner and the empty highway beyond it. The Neon Rosie's sign buzzed weakly against the darkness while Naomi Brooks crouched beside the Mustang with grease streaked across her cheek and trembling fingers wrapped around a rusted wrench. The engine had gone silent again. For a long moment she just sat there on the stained concrete floor listening to the ticking metal cool beneath the hood. Then she closed her eyes and rested her forehead lightly against the frame of the car. "Come on, Dad," she whispered. "Just one sound." Above her workbench hung an old photograph curled at the edges from years of heat and dust. Daniel Brooks stood beside the Mustang in that picture, smiling proudly in a blue mechanic shirt, one hand resting on Naomi's shoulder when she was barely 9 years old. Every night since his death, she had worked beneath that photograph like it was a promise she refused to break. The garage smelled of oil, rainwater, and old memories. Most nights that was enough to keep her going. By 6 the next morning, Naomi was back inside the diner pouring coffee with swollen hands and barely any sleep. Rosie Martinez, the diner owner, noticed immediately. "You look like you wrestled a lawn mower." she muttered while refilling syrup bottles near the counter. Naomi laughed softly. The transmission fought back. Rosie shook her head. That car is going to kill your back before it ever runs. Naomi slid pancakes onto a plate without looking up. Then I guess we both better survive. The morning crowd rolled in with wet boots, newspaper bundles, and local gossip traveling faster than the storm outside. Truckers crowded the booths nearest the windows while waitresses hurried between tables balancing hot coffee and scrambled eggs. Somewhere near the register, two men were already talking about Victor Langford's visit the night before. He owns half the city, one man whispered. Why was he even here? Probably scouting land, another answered. People like him do not stop at places like this unless they want something. Naomi pretended not to hear while carrying plates to booth 7. But her eyes drifted once toward the television mounted above the pie display. Victor's face filled the screen beneath a headline about electric vehicle expansion and billion-dollar mergers. Calm, controlled, untouchable. The kind of man who probably forgot conversations 5 minutes after having them. Yet somehow she still remembered the exact way he looked at the Mustang. Not cruel. Worse. Certain. Around noon the diner doors swung open again, bringing a rush of cold wind inside. Naomi turned automatically with a fresh pot of coffee in her hand and nearly stopped breathing. Victor Langford stepped inside wearing a charcoal coat and dark gloves, raindrops still clinging to his shoulders. Every head in the diner lifted. Rosie nearly dropped a tray. Victor walked calmly toward the counter this time instead of the booth by the window. His sharp gray eyes moved briefly toward the garage outside before landing on Naomi. Coffee again? She asked carefully. Black, he replied. She poured it silently while he reached into his coat pocket and unfolded a small newspaper clipping onto the counter between them. Naomi frowned. It was an old racing article from nearly 20 years earlier. The photograph showed the exact same Mustang when it was new, gleaming beneath bright track lights beside a younger Daniel Brooks. Naomi's breath caught. Victor studied her face carefully. Where did you get that car? He asked quietly. Outside. Thunder rumbled somewhere far across the city, while the diner suddenly felt too small for the silence hanging between them. Naomi stared at the newspaper clipping while the sounds of the diner slowly faded into the background. Plates clinked. Coffee hissed on the burner. Somewhere near the kitchen, Rosie called an order for hash browns, but none of it reached her fully anymore. Her eyes stayed locked on the photograph in Victor Langford's hand. The Mustang looked alive in that picture. Deep midnight blue paint shining beneath raceway lights. Chrome polished like silver water. And beside it stood her father, younger than she remembered him, smiling with the same calm confidence he always carried when his hands smelled like engine oil and metal. Victor took a slow sip of coffee. I asked you a question, he said quietly. Naomi swallowed hard before answering. It was my father's. Victor's fingers stopped moving around the coffee mug. For the first time since entering the diner, his expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for the silence to feel heavier. Daniel Brooks, he said carefully. Naomi looked up immediately. You knew him. Victor leaned back slightly, studying her face again as if searching for traces of the man in the old photograph. Everybody in this industry knew him 20 years ago. Naomi frowned. Funny. Nobody talks about him now. The words landed harder than she intended. Victor glanced toward the rain-covered window. Outside, the Mustang sat hidden behind the garage fence beneath the gray afternoon sky. People stop talking about certain things when they become inconvenient, he said at last. Naomi folded her arms tightly. My father was not inconvenient. Victor looked back at her. No, he admitted softly. He was brilliant. The diner seemed to shrink around them. Even Rosie had stopped pretending not to listen. Naomi remembered being 10 years old and sitting cross-legged on the garage floor, while her father explained engines like they were living creatures. He always said machines had personalities. Some stubborn, some loyal, some waiting for the right hands. After he died, banks took the house. Medical bills swallowed everything else. But somehow the Mustang remained, rusting slowly behind the diner while Naomi grew up carrying trays instead of finishing engineering school. Victor unfolded the newspaper clipping completely and slid it toward her. Beneath the photograph was a faded headline. Local engineer stuns Detroit with experimental hybrid Mustang. Naomi blinked twice. Hybrid? She whispered. Victor nodded once. Your father was experimenting with hybrid performance systems years before the market believed in them. Naomi stared at the article again. That is impossible. No, Victor replied calmly. It was revolutionary. Her heart began beating faster now. She looked toward the garage as if seeing the car for the first time all over again. He never told me. Victor's jaw tightened slightly. There are a lot of things Daniel never got the chance to finish. Before Naomi could answer, a loud burst of laughter erupted from a booth near the windows. Two younger men were staring down at a phone screen. One pointed toward the garage outside while shaking his head. There she is, he snorted. Garage girl. Naomi frowned. The other man turned the screen around just enough for her stomach to drop. Someone had recorded her the night before struggling to start the Mustang in the rain. The video was already online. Thousands of views. Comments scrolling endlessly beneath it. People laughing, mocking, calling her delusional for wasting money on junk. One comment read, "Somebody tell Cinderella that rust buckets do not become race cars." The booth erupted in laughter again. Naomi grabbed the coffee pot harder than necessary, her knuckles whitening around the handle. Victor watched her silently for several seconds. Then he reached over, turned the phone face down on the counter, and looked directly at the men in the booth. They stopped laughing immediately. Funny thing about people, Victor said calmly, his voice low enough to chill the entire diner. They always laugh right before history embarrasses them. Then he looked back at Naomi. Tell me something, he said quietly. Does that Mustang still have the original engine? Naomi held Victor Langford's gaze for a long moment before finally nodding once. Yeah, she answered quietly. Original block. Original transmission too. Victor did not speak immediately. He looked almost distracted now, staring through the diner windows toward the garage as rainwater slid down the glass in crooked silver lines. Outside, the old Mustang sat motionless beneath the weak yellow bulb, but suddenly it no longer looked like junk. Not to him. Naomi noticed the shift instantly. The billionaire who had mocked the car less than 24 hours earlier was now studying it like a ghost from his own past. Victor reached for the newspaper clipping again, smoothing one corner carefully against the counter. Your father built something inside that engine nobody else could figure out, he said. Naomi frowned. You keep talking like the car matters. Victor looked back at her. It does. The words landed heavily between them. Rosie slowly carried a pie tray into the kitchen, pretending she had not been listening for the last 10 minutes. Even the men at the booth near the windows had gone silent now. Victor lowered his voice. Back in 2004, Daniel Brooks designed a hybrid performance system capable of doubling fuel efficiency without sacrificing horsepower. Naomi blinked. That was 20 years ago. Exactly. She stared at him in disbelief. Victor leaned slightly closer across the counter. The entire industry thought he was crazy. Naomi's eyes drifted toward the garage again. Suddenly she remembered late nights as a child hearing strange electrical humming beneath the hood while her father worked long after midnight. He always stopped when she came outside. Always smiled. Always changed the subject. Her chest tightened painfully at the memory. If the engine is still intact, Victor continued carefully, that car could be worth a fortune. Naomi let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. Funny, she said softly, because all anybody else sees is scrap metal. Victor did not answer. Outside, thunder rolled low over Ashbury while the diner lights flickered once. Naomi looked down at her hands. Small burns crossed her fingers from years of cheap tools and overheated engine parts. She had spent almost every paycheck trying to keep the Mustang alive. Tips went to spark plugs instead of new shoes. Double shifts paid for rusted replacement parts instead of rent some months. And still the car barely breathed. You really think he built something important? She asked quietly. Victor's expression hardened slightly. I know he did. Before Naomi could ask another question, the bell above the diner door rang again. Two teenage boys entered laughing loudly while holding up a phone screen. Yo, it is Garage Girl. One of them shouted immediately after spotting Naomi. The other laughed harder. Hey, did the dead car finally make it past 5 miles an hour? Naomi froze for half a second. The diner shifted awkwardly around the sound of their voices. One customer lowered his newspaper. Another shook his head quietly. The video had spread farther than she realized. One of the boys lifted his phone proudly toward Victor without even recognizing him. You have got to see this, he laughed. She keeps trying to revive this ancient junker behind the diner. Whole town is watching. Victor took the phone calmly. The video played again. Naomi standing in the rain the night before. Engine coughing weakly. Her face exhausted but determined beneath the garage light. Thousands of comments rolled beneath it now. Some mocking. Some cruel. Some simply amused by the idea of a waitress trying to restore a dead muscle car alone. Victor watched silently until the clip ended. Then he handed the phone back. Do you know why people love watching someone fail? He asked calmly. The teenagers exchanged uncertain glances. Victor answered before they could speak. Because it helps them feel better about quitting on their own dreams. The diner fell completely silent. One of the boys mumbled an apology before both hurried toward the exit with red faces and lowered heads. Naomi looked at Victor carefully now. Something about him had changed again. Less distant. Less untouchable. Almost human. Victor stood slowly and adjusted the cuffs of his coat. 30 days, he said while pulling leather gloves onto his hands. Naomi frowned. What? Victor looked toward the garage one last time. If that Mustang runs in 30 days, he said calmly, I will personally buy this diner and fund every repair your father ever dreamed of finishing. Naomi stared at him in stunned silence while the storm rumbled softly beyond the windows. And if I fail? She asked. Victor opened the diner door. Cold wind swept inside around him. Then, without turning back, he answered quietly. Then the city will forget your name by Christmas. The storm finally broke sometime after midnight, leaving the streets of Ashbury slick and shining beneath pale orange streetlights. Naomi stood alone in the garage behind Rosie's diner staring at the Mustang while Victor Langford's words echoed endlessly in her head. 30 days. The number felt impossible. 30 days to wake up an engine silent for nearly 2 decades. 30 days to prove the entire city wrong. 30 days before people forgot her name. She exhaled slowly and pulled the dusty tarp completely off the Mustang for the first time in years. The old blue paint underneath looked dull beneath the garage light, scratched and faded like something forgotten by time itself. But beneath the dust, the lines of the car were still beautiful, strong, defiant. Naomi ran her fingers gently across the hood. You heard him, she whispered softly. Guess we better make history. The next morning the internet exploded. By breakfast, clips from the diner had spread across every local social media page in Ashbury. Someone had recorded Victor Langford making the challenge. News stations replayed it beside headlines calling it the strangest bet in the city's history. Waitress versus Billionaire. Dead Mustang challenge. 30 days. The entire town suddenly had an opinion. Rosie slammed a newspaper down on the counter hard enough to rattle the syrup bottles. I swear this city survives on gossip and cholesterol, she muttered. Naomi stared at the front page. There she was, grease on her cheek, hair tied back beneath the red bandana, standing beside the Mustang while Victor watched from across the rain-soaked parking lot. This is bad, Rosie whispered. Naomi looked up. Or maybe it is finally honest. By noon, people were already driving past the diner slowly just to stare through the garage fence. Some laughed. Some took pictures. Some shouted encouragement through rolled-down truck windows. Others just shook their heads like they were watching someone walk willingly toward disaster. Naomi ignored all of it. She worked through the lunch rush carrying plates with sore arms and barely enough sleep to stand upright. Then, every night after closing, she disappeared into the garage. The first week nearly broke her. Rusted bolts refused to move. Wiring diagrams made no sense. Half the replacement parts she ordered arrived damaged or wrong entirely. More than once, the engine coughed just enough to raise hope before collapsing back into silence. One night, around 2 in the morning, Naomi sat on the garage floor staring at the open hood while tears burned quietly in her eyes. I do not know what I am doing anymore, she whispered into the empty room. The only answer was rain tapping softly against the metal roof overhead. Then came a knock at the half-open garage door. Naomi looked up quickly. A skinny teenage boy stood there holding 2 paper cups of coffee. He could not have been older than 16. "You are Naomi, right?" he asked nervously. She wiped her face quickly and stood. "Depends who is asking." The boy smiled awkwardly. "My name is Eli Turner. I saw the videos online." Naomi sighed tiredly. "Great." "No," Eli said quickly. "Not like that." He stepped inside carefully, eyes wide as he stared at the Mustang beneath the hanging work light. "My dad used to race old Fords before he passed away," he said softly. "I know a little about carburetors." Naomi studied him suspiciously for a second before noticing the toolbox in his hand. "Old, worn, real. You came here at 2 in the morning because of a carburetor?" she asked. Eli shrugged once. "And because everybody else already decided you were going to fail." The garage went quiet except for the ticking of cooling metal somewhere beneath the hood. Naomi looked at the Mustang again, then at the boy standing awkwardly beside the doorway. Finally, for the first time in days, she smiled a little. "All right," she said, tossing him a wrench. "Let us see what we are working with." And somewhere deep inside the dead engine, hidden beneath years of rust and silence, something shifted. By day 12, the garage behind Rosie's diner no longer looked abandoned. Extension cords snaked across the concrete floor. Toolboxes sat open beneath hanging lights. Empty coffee cups covered every flat surface, and the air smelled permanently of gasoline, solder, and burned rubber. Naomi barely noticed anymore. Her entire world had narrowed down to bolts, wiring, engine diagrams, and the sound of the Mustang almost starting. Almost. Every morning she worked breakfast shifts until her feet ached. Every night she disappeared into the garage with Eli until sunrise painted pale blue light across the highway. Sleep became something she borrowed in 20-minute pieces between diner orders and engine failures. Yet somehow the city kept watching. Cars lined up outside the diner now just to peek through the fence. Some people brought folding chairs like it was entertainment. Teenagers filmed videos through the garage windows while narrating every failed engine test like sports commentators. The internet gave Naomi a new nickname, the Ghost Mustang Girl. She hated it. Eli loved it. "It sounds legendary," he said one night while sorting spark plugs across the workbench. Naomi rolled her eyes without looking up from beneath the hood. "It sounds ridiculous." Eli grinned. "So does rebuilding a dead hybrid Mustang in 30 days. Naomi tightened another bolt carefully. "Then maybe. We are both ridiculous." The engine suddenly coughed again. Louder this time. Both of them froze instantly. The entire garage fell silent except for the ticking hum beneath the hood. Naomi slowly turned the ignition once more. The engine sputtered hard enough to shake the entire frame before dying again with a sharp metallic clunk. Eli stared wide-eyed. That was different. Naomi's pulse hammered in her ears. "Yeah," she whispered. "It was." But victory lasted less than 30 seconds. Thick gray smoke curled from beneath the dashboard, carrying the sharp smell of overheated wiring. Eli jumped backward coughing while Naomi killed the battery immediately. Silence crashed down over the garage once more. Naomi closed her eyes slowly and leaned both hands against the roof of the Mustang. "No," she muttered softly. "No, no, no." Eli carefully opened the passenger side panel. His face dropped instantly. "These wires are fried." Naomi stared at the tangled mess of old hybrid circuitry hidden beneath the dashboard. Half of it looked homemade. None of it matched modern systems she recognized. Tiny handwritten labels covered sections of the wiring in faded marker. DB Prototype B. Test Run 4. Battery Sync Manual. Her father's handwriting. Naomi swallowed hard. "I cannot fix this," she whispered. Eli looked up quickly. "Yes, you can." "No," she stepped back slowly from the car. "This is not normal engine work anymore. This is engineering. My father built something nobody understands." Rain rattled softly against the garage roof while frustration pressed heavily into the room. Naomi pulled off her gloves and sat down hard on an old wooden stool, exhaustion finally catching up to her all at once. "Maybe Victor was wrong," she murmured quietly. "Maybe this thing really is dead." Eli stared at her like she had just spoken another language entirely. "You do not actually believe that?" Naomi laughed bitterly. You know what everybody online says? Eli shrugged. People online think cereal is a personality trait. Despite herself, Naomi smiled faintly. Eli stepped closer to the Mustang, running his fingers carefully along the faded steering wheel. My dad used to say old cars. Remember who believes in them, he said softly. Naomi looked down at the grease covering her hands. 20 years of silence. 20 years of rust. 20 years since her father disappeared from the industry and left behind questions nobody answered. Maybe she had spent so much time trying to revive the Mustang because losing the car would feel like losing him all over again. Then her eyes caught something strange beneath the driver's seat. A small metal compartment she had never noticed before. Naomi frowned and knelt beside the floorboard, pulling the hidden latch carefully. The compartment clicked open with a sharp metallic snap. Inside sat a dusty cassette tape and a folded envelope sealed with her father's handwriting across the front. For Naomi, the garage suddenly felt colder than before. Eli looked at her carefully. What is it? Naomi picked up the envelope with trembling fingers while rain whispered against the roof overhead. I think, she said quietly, my dad knew this day would come. Naomi stared at the envelope for nearly a full minute before opening it. Her father's handwriting stretched across the front in faded black ink, slightly crooked like he had written it in a hurry. The garage suddenly felt impossibly quiet. Even Eli stopped moving. Rain tapped softly against the roof while the old Mustang sat beneath the hanging work light like it was waiting too. Naomi carefully unfolded the letter with grease-stained fingers. Inside was a single handwritten page and a cassette tape labeled Project Ghost. Her chest tightened immediately. She recognized the handwriting instantly. Strong, sharp, familiar enough to ache. Naomi, if you are reading this, then either I finally fixed the Mustang, or you did not give up on it the way everybody expected you to. Naomi closed her eyes briefly at the sound of his voice already forming inside her memory. Eli watched quietly while she continued reading. What is hidden inside that car matters, but not because of money. Not because of investors. Not because of Langford Motors. It matters because people deserve to know the truth about who built it. Naomi frowned slightly at the mention of Victor Langford's company. Her eyes moved faster now. 20 years ago, your father built an engine system nobody wanted to believe in. They said it was impossible, dangerous, too expensive. But the truth is simpler than that. It threatened people already making billions from failure. Naomi's breathing slowed. Eli leaned closer. What does that mean? Naomi shook her head slightly and kept reading. I trusted the wrong people. One of them stayed silent when it mattered most. But I do not want revenge, sweetheart. I only want proof. That car is proof. If the hybrid core still works, then the engine inside that Mustang can change everything. Naomi lowered the letter slowly. The garage hummed faintly around them beneath the storm outside. Hybrid core. Eli whispered. Naomi immediately grabbed the cassette tape and stared at it carefully. Dust covered the edges. The label had nearly faded away. Project Ghost. She turned toward an old storage cabinet near the back wall and dug through boxes until she found a battered cassette player beneath a pile of tools and manuals. Eli plugged it into the wall while Naomi inserted the tape with trembling hands. For a second there was only static. Then her father's voice filled the garage. Testing log. September 17, 2004. Naomi froze completely. Daniel Brooks sounded younger than she remembered. Calm, focused, tired. If you are hearing this, the recording continued, then I probably ran out of time. Naomi pressed a hand over her mouth quietly. The hybrid core is hidden beneath the rear chassis compartment. Nobody knows it exists except me. Eli's eyes widened instantly. Wait. Hidden where? Naomi was already moving. Both of them rushed toward the back of the Mustang with flashlights shaking in their hands. Beneath layers of rusted plating near the rear axle sat a small reinforced compartment almost invisible beneath years of dirt and corrosion. Naomi carefully loosened the bolts one by one until the metal panel finally dropped open. Inside rested a sleek silver cylinder connected to wiring unlike anything she had ever seen before. Even after 20 years, faint blue indicator lights still blinked softly beneath the dust. Eli stared speechless. That thing is still alive. Naomi reached toward it carefully like touching something sacred. Oh my God, she whispered. Suddenly the cassette crackled again behind them. Daniel's voice returned softer this time. Naomi, if Victor Langford ever comes back into your life, listen carefully. He was not the man who betrayed me. Naomi slowly looked up. The rain outside intensified against the roof while the garage lights flickered once overhead. He tried to stop them, Daniel continued quietly. But sometimes good men stay silent too long. Naomi felt the air leave her lungs. For days she had wondered why Victor kept returning to the diner. Why he looked at the Mustang with guilt instead of greed. Now, for the first time, she understood there was a story hidden beneath all of it. A dangerous one. The tape hissed softly before Daniel spoke one final sentence. And if the engine ever wakes up again, he whispered, the whole city will finally know who buried the truth. Then the recording stopped. Day 28 arrived with freezing rain and a garage full of silence. Naomi had not slept properly in almost 3 days. Dark circles shadowed her eyes while grease stained nearly every inch of her hands and sleeves. Eli sat cross-legged near the workbench surrounded by wires, empty energy drink cans, and engine schematics spread across the concrete floor like battle plans. The hidden hybrid core now rested fully connected beneath the Mustang's rear chassis, glowing faintly blue whenever the power surged correctly for half a second before failing again. Half a second. That was all they could get. Half a second before the system collapsed into silence. Naomi leaned over the engine bay, tightening another connector with trembling fingers. Try it again, she whispered. Eli turned the ignition carefully. The Mustang roared violently for one breathtaking moment. Lights flickered across the dashboard. The garage shook. Then the engine died with a sharp electrical snap, plunging everything back into stillness. Naomi slammed the wrench down onto the workbench and stepped away from the car. I cannot do this anymore. Eli stood quickly. Yes, you can. No. Her voice cracked this time. I have tried everything. Rain pounded against the roof hard enough to drown out the highway outside. Naomi pressed both hands against her face, exhaustion finally crushing through all the determination she had forced herself to carry. Maybe the city was right, she whispered. Maybe I have been chasing a ghost. Then came the sound of tires crunching slowly across wet gravel outside the garage. Both of them looked toward the doorway as headlights swept through the darkness. A black Rolls-Royce stopped beside the fence. Victor Langford stepped out alone beneath the storm, carrying a long metal toolbox in one hand. Naomi stiffened instantly. We are closed, she muttered tiredly. Victor ignored the comment entirely. Rainwater slid down his coat while he walked straight toward the Mustang. For several seconds he said nothing. He simply stared at the open engine bay beneath the hanging work light. Then he quietly placed the toolbox onto the workbench. Naomi frowned. What is that? Victor opened the lid carefully. Inside rested dozens of old engineering notebooks, custom tools, handwritten diagrams, and faded photographs. Naomi's breath caught immediately. Daniel Brooks's name was written across half of them. Your father left these in my office 20 years ago, Victor said softly. I could never bring myself to throw them away. Naomi stared speechless while Victor picked up one worn notebook from the box. The hybrid core is overheating during synchronization, he said calmly. That is why the ignition keeps collapsing. Eli blinked in surprise. How do you know that? Victor flipped open the notebook to a page filled with handwritten calculations and engine sketches. Because Daniel solved this problem before either of you were born. Naomi slowly stepped closer. Her father's notes covered every inch of the page. Battery sequence adjustments. Cooling bypass instructions. A final line circled heavily near the bottom. Do not sink above 3,000 revolutions per minute during initial startup. Naomi looked at Victor carefully now. You really tried to help him, did you not? Victor stayed silent for a moment too long. Rain whispered around the garage while the Mustang sat waiting between them. Finally, Victor nodded once. Not enough. The words landed heavily in the room. Naomi saw it clearly now. The guilt he carried every time he looked at the car. Every time he said her father's name. Victor moved toward the engine and rolled up his sleeves without another word. You are adjusting timing too early, he muttered while reaching for a wrench. Naomi blinked. You are helping us? Victor glanced at her briefly. Your father once stayed awake for 48 hours helping me save my first prototype engine. He tightened a connector carefully beneath the hood. Seems rude not to return the favor. For the next 4 hours the garage became something alive. 3 people moving beneath flickering lights and thunder outside. Eli reading diagrams aloud. Naomi adjusting hybrid wiring with steady hands. Victor recalibrating timing sequences from memory older than some buildings in Ashbury. Near dawn, the storm finally began to fade. Pale blue morning light crept slowly through the garage windows while Naomi slid into the driver's seat one more time. Her hands trembled against the wheel. Victor stepped back silently. Eli held his breath near the workbench. Naomi turned the key. For one terrifying second, nothing happened at all. Then the hybrid core ignited with a deep electric hum beneath the chassis. The Mustang shuddered violently. Lights burst alive across the dashboard. And for the first time in 20 years, the engine did not die. The engine growled through the garage like something waking from a 20-year sleep. Naomi sat frozen behind the wheel while the entire Mustang trembled around her, headlights glowing pale gold against the rain-streaked walls. Eli shouted loud enough to echo off the metal roof. Victor Langford simply stood there beside the workbench staring at the car with both hands resting against the edge of the table, as if he needed something solid to hold onto. The sound was not perfect yet. The idle stumbled slightly. A faint electrical whine pulsed beneath the hood where the hybrid core synchronized unevenly with the old V8 engine. But it was alive. Naomi's hands tightened around the steering wheel, while tears blurred her vision. For a moment she was 9 years old again, sitting in her father's lap listening to him laugh whenever the Mustang shook the garage windows. "Engines have heartbeats," he used to tell her. "You just have to listen close enough." The Mustang rumbled harder beneath her hands now like it remembered him too. Eli leaned through the passenger window grinning uncontrollably. "Do you realize what this means?" Naomi laughed softly through tears. "Honestly? No." Victor slowly stepped toward the driver's side door. The engine light reflected faintly across his face, but for the first time since Naomi met him, the billionaire no longer looked untouchable. He looked tired, human. "Your father did it," he said quietly. Naomi looked up at him. Victor nodded toward the humming hybrid system beneath the chassis. 20 years ahead of everybody else. Outside, dawn spread slowly across Ashbury in streaks of pale blue and silver. The rain had finally stopped. For a few fragile seconds the garage felt peaceful. Then Naomi noticed headlights gathering outside the fence. Cars. Phones. Cameras. Someone had posted another video online. By sunrise, half the town had already arrived outside Rosie's diner. People crowded the sidewalks wrapped in coats and hoodies while news vans parked along the highway shoulder. Reporters stood beneath umbrellas speaking excitedly into microphones. The ghost Mustang had finally come back to life. Naomi stepped out of the garage slowly, overwhelmed by the noise waiting outside. Flashes exploded immediately from every direction. "Naomi, is it true? Did you really rebuild Daniel Brooks's engine? What does Victor Langford have to do with this?" Questions slammed toward her faster than she could breathe. Rosie stood protectively near the diner doors, shaking her head at reporters while Eli stared at the crowd in disbelief. Victor emerged behind Naomi a moment later, and the entire street fell strangely quiet. He looked at the cameras for a long time before finally speaking. 20 years ago, he said calmly, Daniel Brooks created technology this industry was too afraid to understand. Reporters immediately surged closer. Victor did not move. And when powerful people buried his work, I stayed silent. Naomi looked at him sharply. Even the city noise seemed to pause around those words. Victor glanced toward the Mustang behind the garage fence. That silence cost a good man everything, he continued quietly. I will regret that for the rest of my life. One reporter stepped forward carefully. Are you saying Daniel Brooks was never a fraud? Victor's jaw tightened. I am saying the world owes him an apology. The crowd erupted instantly with shouting questions and camera flashes, but Naomi barely heard any of it anymore. Her eyes drifted back toward the garage where the Mustang still idled softly beneath the morning light. Alive. Real. Waiting. Victor reached into his coat pocket and handed Naomi a folded document. What is this? She asked quietly. The deed to Rosie's diner, he answered. Naomi stared at him in shock. Victor gave the faintest smile. I keep my promises. She looked down at the papers again, then slowly shook her head. I do not want the diner. Victor frowned slightly. No. Naomi looked toward Eli standing proudly beside the garage, then toward the crowd of young kids peeking through the fence hoping to catch one glimpse of the Mustang. Finally, she smiled softly. But I do know what my father would have wanted. 3 months later, the old garage behind Rosie's Diner became Brooks Academy for Automotive Innovation, a free training center for students who could not afford engineering school. And every morning before classes began, Naomi opened the garage doors herself while the restored blue Mustang sat beneath the lights humming quietly like a second heartbeat. Some engines, after all, were never meant to stay buried.